Hi, this is AJ Hartley. I'm doing another of these little off-the-cuff video things where I talk about stuff, specifically, books that I've written. Talk about how they came to be, what I think might be of value to them, to me, right? Things that I like about them. And I had, put out a general request for people making suggestions as to which books I should talk about because I've written a lot of books at this point. And a number of people for a while now have been saying that they wanted me to talk about Coldbath Street, which is this, if you can see that. And Coldbath Street is my first ghost story. There's a sequel called Written Stone Lane, which I'll talk about another time. First ghost story, the closest thing to horror that I'd ever written, I suppose. The premise of the story, this is the paperback. This is only available in a UK edition at the moment, at least. This is the original paperback. There's also a very nice glossy hardcover, which came out as a kind of collector's edition, which has, among other things, a nice map in the front, which is very cool. A map of my hometown, Preston, which I'll talk about in a second. So the premise of the story is that it's set in 1978, and it follows a 16-year-old character called Preston Oldcoin, who is coming home from Scouts, which he doesn't like very much. And he has a sort of fear of local stories, ghost stories that he's been hearing, and he has an encounter on the way home with one of these ghosts called the Bannister Doll, and it kills him in the first chapter. And then he wakes up and gradually realizes that he is in fact dead. But for him, at least this stage of death, insofar as within these stories death has stages, he is in a world that looks exactly like the world he was in before, except there are no people. So it's always 9:22 in the evening. It's always a late fall, autumn night, and nothing changes. And the town that he's in, this sort of largely industrial, working class northern English town, is the way he remembers it. And specifically, he remembers it because it turns out that he can't actually go anywhere that he didn't go in life. And in the course of the story, we also start to realize that the longer he exists as a ghost in this kind of weird no man's land, the more the town around him starts to shrink as his sort of memory begins to fade. He becomes sort of increasingly trapped by a more and more limited notion of the place, and therefore a more and more limited notion of himself, right? The idea is that the ghosts are constantly trying to hold on to some version of who they are, and that over time they lose that, and they gradually get distilled down to a single passion, a single mission or emotion, which defines them to the exclusion of everything else. And that's the idea. He's not the only ghost there. There are other ghosts, and some of them are dangerous. And the first question is, well, if you're already dead, how much worse can it get? Well, it turns out it can get worse, quite a bit worse. And this is partly because, as I said, the idea of death that he's in is this sort of weird kind of holding pattern. And the implication is there is a way beyond it, though what comes next, nobody knows. Preston, the character, doesn't know. And some of the ghosts he meets are desperate not to move on, whatever that means, and are constantly trying to somehow reconnect with the living present in the hope that other people's memories or ideas about them somehow keeps their life essence somehow. and it's an adventure story. You know, it's a mystery, right? Because it's about Preston then has to sort of figure out what happened to him, what it was that killed him, and if there's any kind of way back, and if there's not, if there's any way to somehow release the other ghosts that he encounters without falling foul of the most dangerous ones that can do really bad things to you in ways that will shape an eternity. Um, the story, I guess, evolved when I was an undergraduate in Manchester in the early 14th century. I wrote a short story about a ghost story in which the reveal at the end was that the protagonist, the speaker of the story, was actually the ghost. And I had always liked that idea. It's not like it's never been done before, but I liked the idea of writing a ghost story from the perspective of the ghost, though it does then raise questions about, if you're already a ghost, what else can happen? And a lot of the process of writing this book was about thinking through the logical implications of, how do ghosts interact with the living world, the present, right? Because for me, it's a temporal issue, right? Being a ghost is very much about time because you're out of the living present and you lose track of how much time has passed since you died, for example. So some of the ghosts have been there for hundreds of years and don't realize it, you know. But you have to sort of make the rules and then try to stick to them. How possible is it for the ghosts to reach into the living present, and how do they manifest when they get there? So as I said, the story had been kicking around for years in this embryonic short story version, and I thought I kind of like the idea of developing a completely different story into a novel. And I had just finished writing the Steeplejack series, which I will talk about in another video soon, probably 3 videos, which was set in a version of a kind of Victorian South Africa and centered on a character who was very much not me, right? And I thought if I wanted to write another young adult novel, I wanted to draw explicitly on my own experience as an adolescent, right? And that meant, there's a lot of nonsense talked about timelessness in stories. And for the most part, the more generic you try to write, the more universally you try to make your stories and your characters, the less it works. I think, good stories and good characters are tied to very specific circumstances, real places, and a real cultural moment. And I started to feel like, rather than try to write about the kind of adolescence that my son was experiencing, for example, in the present, in Charlotte, North Carolina, in 20, whatever it was, 16 or so when I was writing this. I wanted to really sort of delve into my own adolescence. I wanted to be able to talk about things like music and what was on telly and so on in ways that felt absolutely real, in ways that I could pinpoint and help to shape the character and the world of the story. And that meant setting the story in the past, setting the story in Lancashire, in Preston, where I grew up, and setting it in the late 70s, which is when I was an adolescent, tragically. So that was what I set out to do. And of course, one of the great things about the internet is that you can find out. It's not hard to go back and find out what was on television and what was on Top of the Pops on this particular Thursday night. And, the bands that I grew up listening to and things like that stamped my own sense of my past. And I think, this is important because, as I say, I've lived in the States. I haven't lived in the UK now for 35 years more. And when I go back, which I do as often as I can, there's a curious sense in which the places that I grew up have evolved without me. I go back to them and things are not quite the way I remember them, and or they've changed, they've become different things, or what they were when I knew them is long gone and people barely remember them. Whereas Preston for me is still defined by the way that it was when I lived there, understandably. And a couple of times when I went back, I found myself wandering around, feeling this sort of curious sense of my own irrelevance. And I started to feel like the ghost, right? That I had died, at least as far as this place was concerned. I had died, and the place had grown and gone on without me, and I was kind of in this weird no place. And I think this was complicated also by the fact that my father was, between me starting to write the book, and the book getting published, my father died. So, it's a ghost story, but it's very much a sort of rumination on mortality and loss. It's still an adventure, and it's still sort of scary, at least in parts, I hope. But yeah, it has this sort of fairly dark undercurrent, so that in some ways, it feels like an adolescent novel, a YA, a young adult novel. And in some ways it doesn't. It feels like a fairly mature book because it's very much about the passage of time and being disconnected from your own childhood and your own adolescence and so on. So yeah, and it is a book that's very much shaped by that place. And so, I was doing a lot of research and talking to a lot of old friends who still live there and having them, sending me pictures and things. Thanks, Steve. And then when the book came out, and the book came out also with a small local Lancashire press connected to a university, UCLan Publishing. So it was very much a local release. And I was kind of anxious about it, because obviously I've not been there a long time, and it's difficult to, write about a place that you don't live anymore and feel like you're trying to do it in an authentic and respectful way. And things like dialect, I wanted to sort of evoke a Lancashire dialect. But that's a risky thing to do in fiction, because it can easily look like you're, I don't know, being reductive somehow or making fun of people or something like that. And I really didn't want to do that. So, trying to get that balance between between something that would have enough of the sound in the way that people spoke in the book, but would still be sort of generally readable by people who didn't have that accent and that sense of the sound of the dialect, but also didn't diminish the characters, didn't diminish the story. So I wanted it to be absolutely rooted. And this came up also with the audiobook when we started talking about an audiobook and I was asked who the ideal narrator would be for the audiobook. And I said Christopher Eccleston, because Chris is the same age as me, and he's from Salford, which is a little ways down the road towards Manchester. But he grew up in a similar sort of circumstance. He had a kind of gut connection to this sort of a story. Again, sort of working class upbringing, more than mine probably. So we were very lucky that Chris agreed to do it. So this is out on audio, performed by one of the Doctor Who's, which is kind of cool. But what I was going to say was that when the book came out, and it was really embraced by the local community in ways that I'm still really touched and grateful for. And of course, I'm going to make mistakes, and not everybody's going to like it. That's okay. Not holding out for universal popularity. But but it was very satisfying to sort of reconnect in fiction through the place that made me to a large extent who I am, even though I don't live there now. What else? I wrote it as a standalone. I wanted to make sure that the book had beginning, a middle, and an end. There was a sense of closure. But my sense of what that closure was changed in the course of the story. So, even so, it still felt like the book was complete. And it wasn't until later on that I decided, a couple of years afterwards, I think actually, that I started considering the possibility of a sequel, which I wrote and which I'll talk about another time. The other thing I was going to say it was that part of anchoring the story in the place and that particular moment was that I wanted to build the stories that I grew up with, the local legends and ghost stories that we told each other as kids, and build them into the fabric of the story and weave them into the history of the place so that it felt grounded, and so there are a number of stories that I remember being told when I was little, some of which scared the living daylights out of me. But of course, with ghost stories, they tend to be shifting because it's an oral tradition, right? It's not like that the nature of the story stays nailed down. It's constantly shifting and evolving depending on who's telling the story and how it gets passed on from one person to the next. So, I started from the version of the stories that I remembered and then started doing research and trying to sort of find either the quote-unquote definitive version of the local story, but also any sort of possibilities of historical circumstances that might have generated that story. So, for example, the Bannister doll story that I mentioned right at the beginning, was very sort of garbled and mostly impressions in the way that I was told it, and it was connected to a kind of ritual where you knocked on the banister 3 times and then the ghost would appear to you. Why you would do this, I don't know. But though I think we did at one point and convinced ourselves that terrible things had happened during the night and we were terrified. That's the thing about ghost stories, though, isn't it? But then, the more I read about it, the more I started to find other stories that fleshed out the legend in completely different ways. And, Bannister was not the Bannister as in the Bannister Rail so much as it was the name of the girl, supposedly, right? There are, as I say, multiple versions of these stories, some of them significantly older than others. And a lot of them are shaky. So it's a question, as a novelist, then, of picking the version that you think is best or which is most suited to your story, and then trying to sort of dig down and make it work. But it's very much an exercise in storytelling. The novel becomes an outgrowth of that ghost story tradition, the oral tradition that we'd grown up with. But when I came to actually sell the book, US publishers weren't interested because they said it was too British, which I could have told them, of course it's too British, that it's supposed to be, it's amazing. There's a special kind of provincialism in America sometimes, that anything set in New York is considered to be somehow universally applicable. And it's like, well, the rest of us are putting up with your brand of provincialism all the time, so maybe you should suck it up and learn something about other countries for once. But anyway, not that I'm bitter, but yes, it means that the only editions at the moment are the UK editions. Maybe that will change, but I don't know. So I think that's all I want to say about this for the moment, and I will think about what I'm going to talk about next. I'm open to suggestions, and I guess you can subscribe to this channel should you feel the strange compulsion to do so. All right, thanks. Talk to you soon.